think a moon is on its way.
Some artists leave behind a lifetime of work. Others barely get started before they're gone. Nick Drake recorded just 3 albums in his brief career. He never had a hit single. He rarely performed live. Most people had never heard of him when he died in 1974 at age 26. Yet decades later, his music reaches millions. His influence touches countless artists, and his story continues to fascinate new generations. So what really happened to Nick Drake? Early life. A privileged beginning. Nicholas Rodney Drake was born on June 19, 1948, in Rangoon, Burma, which is now Yangon, Myanmar. His father, Rodney Drake, worked as an engineer for the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation. His mother, Molly Drake, was a songwriter and musician herself, though she never pursued it professionally. Nick also had an older sister, Gabrielle, who would later become a well-known actress in Britain. The family moved back to England in 1950, when Nick was just 2 years old. They settled in Tanworth in Arden, a small, picturesque village in Warwickshire. The Drakes lived in a house called Far Lays, and by all accounts, it was a warm, creative, and loving home. This wasn't a troubled childhood, like so many tragic artists endured. Nick grew up surrounded by music, comfort, and encouragement. His mother Molly was particularly important to his musical development. She wrote her own songs and recorded them on the family's tape machine. For young Nick, hearing his mother compose and perform was completely normal. He didn't realize until later that not everyone's mother did that. The act of turning feelings into songs, of responding to the world through music, was simply part of life in the Drake household. Nick attended Marlborough College, a prestigious boarding school. There, he learned to play clarinet and piano, showing talent in both. He was good-looking, well-liked, and seemed to have everything going for him. But even then, friends noticed something different about him. He was quiet, thoughtful, a bit withdrawn. Not in a concerning way, just in his nature. At 16, Nick picked up the guitar. That's when everything changed. He became obsessed with it. He spent hours practicing, experimenting with different tunings, teaching himself complex finger-picking patterns. He was drawn to the folk music scene, listening to Bob Dylan, Bert Jansch, Phil Ochs, and John Martin. But Nick wasn't interested in imitating anyone. He was developing his own voice, his own style, something entirely his own. In 1966, Nick enrolled at Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, to study English literature. But his heart wasn't in academics. Before even starting at Cambridge, he spent time studying French at the University of Aix-en-Provence in France. While there, he and some friends decided to take off for Morocco. It was his first real taste of independence, of doing whatever he wanted without anyone telling him otherwise. There's a remarkable moment from that trip. Nick and his friends ended up in Tangiers, where they crossed paths with the Rolling Stones. Somehow, Nick ended up playing guitar for Mick Jagger. Here was this 18-year-old kid, unknown, strumming his songs for one of the biggest rock stars in the world. We don't know what Jagger thought of it, but it must have been surreal for Nick. Cambridge and discovery. Nick arrived at Cambridge in October 1967, somewhat reluctantly. He had performed poorly in his academic studies throughout school. Getting into Cambridge had been a squeeze, helped along by connections between Marlborough and Fitzwilliam College. His father pushed for it, wanting Nick to have a degree as security, but Nick didn't place much value on academic achievement. He wasn't interested in intellectual snobbery or proving anything to anyone. Instead, he poured himself into music. He started performing at local clubs and coffee houses around Cambridge and London. These weren't big shows, just intimate settings where he could share his songs. And one night in 1968, at a small London venue, the right person happened to be in the audience. Ashley Hutchings, the bass player for Fairport Convention, heard Nick play and was immediately struck by his talent. Hutchings introduced Nick to other members of Fairport Convention, and, crucially, to Joe Boyd, an American producer who was making waves in the British folk scene. Boyd had worked with artists like the Incredible String Band and was known for his ear for talent. Boyd heard something special in Nick. He signed him to Island Records, one of the hippest labels in the UK at the time, home to artists like Jethro Tull, Free, King Crimson, and Mott the Hoople. Nick Drake, still a Cambridge student, had a record deal at age 20. His father wasn't thrilled. Rodney wrote long letters to his son, pointing out the disadvantages of leaving university before graduation. A degree was a safety net, he argued. At least you'd have something to fall back on. Nick's response was telling. A safety net was the one thing he did not want. In late 1968 and early 1969, Nick would skip lectures, catch the train from Cambridge to London, and record at Sound Technique's studio with Boyd producing and John Wood engineering. He was making his debut album while supposedly studying English literature. 9 months before graduation, he left Cambridge entirely to focus on finishing the record. 5 Leaves Left, the first album. 5 Leaves Left was released in July 1969. The title came from the warning message found near the end of Rizla cigarette rolling paper packs. It was a gentle album filled with intricate guitar work, string arrangements by Robert Kirby, and Nick's soft, melancholic voice. Songs like Riverman, Cello Song, Time Has Told Me, and Fruit Tree showcased his extraordinary talent. The album had a light, breezy quality despite its underlying sadness. Nick's guitar playing was sophisticated, using alternative tunings and complex finger picking that most listeners couldn't fully appreciate on first listen. The production was lush, but never overwhelming. Everything served the songs, the mood, the atmosphere Nick was creating. Critics who heard it were impressed, but not many people heard it. Island Records was promoting bigger, louder acts. 5 Leaves Left got lost in the shuffle. It sold poorly, just a few thousand copies, and Nick refused to do anything to promote it. He wouldn't give interviews, he wouldn't go on radio, he hated the idea of selling himself. His live performances didn't help. Nick was painfully shy and awkward on stage. He would mumble between songs. He'd pause frequently to retune his guitar because he used so many different tunings. He looked uncomfortable, nervous, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Audiences didn't know what to make of him. One observer described watching Nick perform as being at the bedside of a dying man who wants to tell you a secret but keeps changing his mind at the last minute. That's a haunting image, and it captures something essential about Nick Drake. He had something profound to communicate, but connecting with people terrified him. Brighter Later, Seeking Success. Despite the poor sales of his debut, Joe Boyd believed in Nick and wanted to try again. For the second album, they aimed for something more commercial, more upbeat, jazzier. Brighter Later, released in 1971, featured a full backing band, including musicians from Fairport Convention and even John Cale from the Velvet Underground on 2 tracks. The album had moments of real brightness. Hazy Jane I, Hazy Jane II, Northern Sky, At the Chime of a City Clock. These were beautiful songs, more accessible than 5 Leaves Left. Producer Joe Boyd thought this could be the one that broke through. He later said they imagined it as more of a pop sound, more commercial. But Brighter Later was another commercial failure. Reviews were mixed. Some praised Nick's guitar work and the arrangements. Others called it an awkward mix of folk and cocktail jazz. It sold about as poorly as his first album, maybe 5,000 copies. Island Records urged Nick to promote it, do interviews, play live shows, radio sessions, anything. Nick refused. The idea of self-promotion made him deeply uncomfortable. He just wanted to make music, not sell it. The failure of Brighter Later hit Nick hard. Around the same time, Joe Boyd sold his production company Witch Season to Island Records and moved to Los Angeles to work on film soundtracks. Nick lost his mentor, his champion, the one person at the label who truly believed in him. His attitude toward London changed. He had been living in a bedsit in Belsize Park that Boyd had arranged for him. Now he was unhappy, isolated, visibly nervous. In June 1970, he gave one of his final live performances at Ewell Technical College in Surrey. Ralph McTell, who performed that night, remembered Nick as monosyllabic, barely able to communicate. Nick began withdrawing. He pulled away from friends and family. He stopped socializing. The depression that had always lurked beneath the surface was taking hold. Pink Moon, stripping it all away. In October 1971, Nick approached John Wood about recording a third album. Island Records hadn't been expecting one, but Nick was determined. The sessions took place over just 2 nights. It was only Nick and Wood in the studio. No other musicians, no string arrangements, no horns or keyboards. Pink Moon is stark, intimate, almost uncomfortably bare. The album lasts just 28 minutes, 11 songs, most of them short. Nick's voice, his guitar, and on the title track, a brief piano overdub. That's it. John Wood later said the length was just about right. You really wouldn't want it to be any longer. Nick had been dissatisfied with the fuller sound of Brighter Later. He thought it was too elaborate, too much. For Pink Moon, he wanted the opposite. Just him and the guitar, nothing to hide behind. The result is haunting. Songs like Pink Moon, Place to Be, From the Morning and Things Behind the Sun feel like they're being whispered directly into your ear in the middle of the night. There's a famous story about how Nick delivered the album. He supposedly walked into the Island Records office late one night, left the master tapes at reception without saying a word to anyone, and walked out. Whether that's exactly how it happened, the image fits Nick's character. Here's my album. Take it or leave it. I'm done. Pink Moon received even less attention than his first two albums. Island did almost nothing to promote it. Nick did nothing to promote it. It vanished without a trace, selling poorly like everything else he'd released. After completing Pink Moon, Nick essentially gave up. He stopped performing entirely. He stopped recording. He retreated to his parents' home in Tanworth-in-Arden and barely left. His depression deepened. Days would pass where he barely spoke to anyone. The Descent. By 1971, Nick's family was concerned enough to persuade him to see a psychiatrist at St. Thomas's Hospital in London. He was diagnosed with depression and prescribed antidepressants, specifically amitriptyline. But Nick felt uncomfortable about taking medication. He was embarrassed by it. He tried to hide the fact from his friends. His weekly retainer from Island Records, a small amount of money they'd been paying him, eventually stopped. He had no income, no career prospects, no real friends left. He had alienated most people who cared about him through his withdrawal and silence. There was one person Nick had tried to stay close to, Sophia Ride. They had met in London in 1968, and she was described by biographers as the nearest thing to a girlfriend Nick ever had. But Sophia herself called them best friends, rather than romantic partners. The nature of their relationship remains unclear, but it mattered deeply to Nick. In mid-November 1974, about a week before his death, Sophia told Nick she needed space. She couldn't cope with the intensity of the relationship anymore. She asked him for time. Those were among the last words they exchanged. She never saw him again. Around the same time, Nick had a heated argument with his friend John Martin, another singer-songwriter he'd known for years. They had some kind of falling out that was never resolved. Martin was reportedly destroyed by this when Nick died, carrying that guilt for the rest of his life. Nick spent his final months at his parents' home, sleeping late, staying in his room, barely engaging with the world. His mother later recalled that in mid-1974, Nick had briefly shown signs of life. He went back into the studio with John Wood to record a few more songs. The sessions didn't go particularly well. His friend and producer Joe Boyd recalled being shocked by Nick's anger and bitterness during these recordings. Nick was furious. Boyd had told him he was a genius. Other people had agreed. So why wasn't he famous? Why wasn't he rich? This rage, Boyd said, must have been festering beneath that inexpressive exterior for years. Despite the difficulties, the return to Sound Technique's studio seemed to lift Nick's spirits temporarily. His mother said they were thrilled because there hadn't been any happiness in Nick's life for years, but it didn't last.
Would you love me till I'm dead?
November 25th, 1974. On the morning of November 25th, 1974, the Drake family's housemaid went to check on Nick around 11:45 a.m. She called out to him, but got no response. She alerted Nick's mother, Molly, who went into his room. Nick was in bed, motionless. His mother's first thought was about his long legs stretched out in the bed. Then she realized he wasn't breathing. Nick Drake was dead at age 26. An album of Bach's Brandenburg concertos was on the turntable. A copy of Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, in the original French, lay beside his bed. Molly would hold on to that book for years, trying to read it, hoping it would help her understand what happened to her son. There was no suicide note. However, police found an unsealed letter addressed to Sophia Ride near his bed. It read, "Dear Sophia, I'm really sorry to have taken up so much of your time thinking there might be something in it, but I was wrong." The inquest was held on December 18th, 1974. The coroner examined the evidence and concluded that Nick had died from acute amitriptyline poisoning, self-administered while suffering from a depressive illness. Stomach samples revealed a minimum of 35 pills. Blood samples suggested he may have taken up to 50 additional pills. The official verdict was suicide. Nick's family disputed this conclusion. They insisted it was an accident, that Nick had taken too many pills but hadn't meant to kill himself. It's a debate that continues to this day. Was it deliberate? Was it accidental? Did Nick miscalculate his dose? Did he know exactly what he was doing? We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that on November 25th, 1974, Nick Drake's troubled, brilliant, far too short life came to an end. The aftermath. On December 2nd, 1974, a small funeral service was held at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Tamworth in Arden. About 50 people attended, friends and family gathering to say goodbye. Several attendees later remarked that they'd never met each other before. Nick had kept different parts of his life so separate that even in death, the people who knew him didn't know each other. Nick's body was cremated at Solihull Crematorium, and his ashes were buried under an oak tree in the church graveyard. His mother later sent the letter Nick had written to Sophia. Sophia wrote back with gratitude, saying, "The more I think, the more I accept what has happened as being the best for him in many ways. Nick really was a very special person." In the immediate aftermath of Nick's death, nothing much happened. There were no documentaries, no compilation albums, no tributes in the music press. His albums remained available on Island Records, but nobody was buying them. Nick Drake faded into obscurity, just another forgotten artist who never made it. But something interesting was happening quietly, slowly. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, people kept discovering his music. Word of mouth spread. Musicians began citing him as an influence. In 1979, Island released Fruit Tree, a box set compiling his 3 studio albums plus unreleased tracks and a biography. Sales were poor, but the albums stayed in print. By the mid-1980s, artists like Kate Bush, Paul Weller, Robert Smith of The Cure, Peter Buck of REM, and David Sylvian were talking about Nick Drake's influence on their work. In 1985, the Dream Academy released Life in a Northern Town, a song written for and dedicated to Nick. It became a hit in both the UK and the US. Through the 1990s, Nick's cult following grew. He came to represent a certain type of doomed romantic artist. The first major biography was published in 1997. In 1998, the BBC aired a documentary called A Stranger Among Us. Then came 1999, and everything changed.
I could have been a signpost, could have been a clock.
The Volkswagen commercial. Volkswagen used the title track from Pink Moon in a television commercial. The ad was simple, understated, atmospheric. Just 4 young people driving at night in a VW cabriolet. Nick's delicate voice and guitar in the background. No dialogue, no hard sell, just mood and music. The commercial aired in early 2000, and within a month, Nick Drake had sold more records than he had in the previous 30 years combined. Pink Moon became his biggest posthumous hit. The album charted for the first time ever. Suddenly, millions of people were discovering this music that had been ignored for decades. His songs began appearing in films and television shows. Northern Sky in Serendipity, Fly in The Royal Tenenbaums, Cello Song in Me Without You, One of These Things First in Garden State. Each placement introduced Nick to new audiences who had never heard of him. In 2004, 30 years after his death, Nick Drake finally made it into the UK charts with the compilation album Made to Love Magic, which included a previously unheard song called Toe the Line, believed to be one of the last things he ever recorded. Today, his 3 albums have sold millions of copies combined. His influence extends across genres. Jazz musicians cover Riverman. Indie artists cite Pink Moon as a touchstone. Singer-songwriters study his finger-picking techniques and his approach to melody. The legacy. Nick Drake's story raises questions that don't have easy answers. Why do some artists find success in their lifetimes, while others are only appreciated after they're gone? What if Nick had lived? Would he have eventually found his audience? Would fame and recognition have helped him? Or would they have made things worse? Some people argue that Nick's music became more meaningful because of his tragic death, that the sadness in his songs seems prophetic in hindsight. Others insist his work stands on its own merits, that it would be just as powerful, regardless of how his life ended. His sister Gabrielle became the guardian of his legacy after their parents died. Rodney in 1988 and Molly in 1993. In 2014, Gabrielle published Nick Drake, Remembered for a While, a collection of photos, letters, and artifacts. She worked with biographer Richard Morton Jack on the definitive biography, Nick Drake, The Life, which was published with the full cooperation of the estate. Shortly before Molly Drake died in 1993, she said something that's both heartbreaking and comforting. It's wonderful to know that Nick is not really dead because with people listening to his music, he lives on. And she was right. 50 years after his death, Nick Drake's music continues to reach people. It speaks to those who feel isolated, misunderstood, or out of step with the world. It offers a kind of melancholic beauty that's rare and precious. So what really happened to Nick Drake? On the surface, it's a straightforward story. A talented young man struggled with depression, created 3 beautiful albums that nobody bought, withdrew from the world, and died from an overdose of antidepressants at age 26. Whether it was suicide or an accident remains unclear. But the deeper truth is more complex. Nick Drake was an artist who created something timeless, but couldn't survive long enough to see people appreciate it. He lived in the wrong era for his music. The early 1970s weren't ready for someone so introspective, so quiet, so uncommercial. By the time the world caught up, he was gone. His music endures because it's honest, because it doesn't try to be anything other than what it is. Because Nick Drake, for all his struggles with connection, managed to create songs that connect with millions of people he never met. If you enjoyed learning about Nick Drake's life and music, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the artists who shaped music history. And let us know in the comments, have you discovered Nick Drake's music? Which album speaks to you most? We'd love to hear your thoughts.